Tyler Callahan stood on the dock at 7 in the morning, wearing sunglasses he didn't need, and a smile that had never once been told no, and he said the words like he was ordering a coffee. Hand over the key. Not a request. Not even really a demand. Just an assumption. Spoken out loud. The way people announce things they've already decided are true. Detective Sergeant Maren Castillo, 16 years with the county sheriff's office, 11 of them working homicide and financial crimes before that, stood in the doorway of the cabin she'd bought with her own money, in her own name, closed on 8 months earlier, with a cashier's check and a signature that had taken her 4 years of overtime and a divorce settlement to afford, and she looked at this 26-year-old man standing on her dock in flip-flops holding a clipboard like it was a badge, and she said, "Come again." "The key," Tyler said, slower this time, the way you'd repeat yourself to someone you assumed didn't speak the language well. "To cabin 14. My dad's on the board. We've got a rental group coming in Friday, and this is the unit with the good dock. You've been informed. There's a form." He held the clipboard out like it settled something. Maren did not take the clipboard. She had spent a decade and a half learning to read a room the way other people read a menu. Fast, top to bottom, no wasted motion. And what she read on that dock at 7 in the morning was a young man who had never once in his life been told to leave a place he wanted to be. She had seen that look on plenty of people right before she put them in the back of a car. She had never expected to see it on her own dock, in her own robe, holding her own coffee, in the one place on earth she had bought specifically so nobody could tell her what to do with her life anymore. "You're going to want to take a step back off my property," she said, in the voice she used for people who hadn't yet figured out who they were talking to. "And then you're going to explain to me what form, what rental group, and what exactly gives your father's HOA the authority to hand my cabin's key to a stranger." Tyler Callahan laughed. It was not a nervous laugh. It was the laugh of someone who had genuinely never lost an argument with an adult, because his father had spent 20 years making sure he never had to. "Lady," he said, "I don't think you understand how this community works." She would think about that sentence a lot over the next 4 months. How this community works. She would come to learn, in exhausting, well-documented, admissible detail, exactly how it worked, who it worked for, and how much money had quietly disappeared from 211 households to make sure it kept working that way. But on that morning, standing on her own dock with her coffee going cold in her hand, all she said was, "Get off my property before I decide this is trespassing." And Tyler Callahan, sunburned, entitled, and profoundly unaware that the woman in the doorway carried a badge with more authority in this county than his father's entire board combined, smiled at her like she'd told a joke, turned around, and walked back down the dock like a man who had never once considered that this particular morning might be the beginning of the end of his very comfortable life. "Drop your city, and tell me, do you live in an HOA? I want to know how many of you are watching this from behind enemy lines right now, coffee in hand, silently agreeing with every word Maren didn't get to say." Lake Wren Shores sat 40 minutes outside of Asheboro, North Carolina, tucked around a spring-fed lake that the developers had named after a bird nobody had actually seen there in 30 years. It was the kind of community that photographed beautifully and functioned like a hostage situation. 211 homes, 44 of them lakefront cabins on Heron Point Road, the rest arranged in tidy cul-de-sacs, climbing the ridge behind the water. The brochure, still handed out to prospective buyers at the community's leasing office, used words like timeless, tranquil, and a legacy for generations. It did not use the word predatory, though by the time Maren was finished with her investigation, that was the word the district attorney's office would use in a press release. Maren had found Cabin 14 through an estate sale listing 8 months earlier, back when she was still working double shifts and sleeping in 12-hour blocks whenever she could steal them. Back when the divorce had left her with a house full of furniture, that reminded her of arguments, and a bank account that reminded her of nothing at all, except how much lawyers cost. The cabin had been owned for 30 years by a widow named Eleanor Prosser, who died at 91 with no children, and a nephew in Ohio who wanted nothing but a fast closing. Maren had walked through it once, seen the water through the back windows, the old stone fireplace, the dock that needed new boards but held good bones, and she had known within 4 minutes that this was the place she was going to spend the rest of her life, unlearning what 16 years on patrol and in homicide had done to her nervous system. She'd moved in slow, weekends first, while she finished out her caseload in the city. Then, 6 months in, a transfer to the sheriff's Financial Crimes Division, which ran out of the substation 20 minutes from the lake, and suddenly Cabin 14 wasn't a weekend retreat anymore. It was home. She refinished the dock herself, one board at a time, because there was something about doing careful, deliberate physical work with her hands that undid some of what the job put into her head. She planted tomatoes she wasn't sure would survive the clay soil. She learned the names of her neighbors up and down Heron Point Road, the Alvarezes at Cabin 9, who ran a diner in town and brought her pie unprompted. Old Mr. Denby at Cabin 11, 83 years old, widower, who fished off his dock every morning, at the same hour, with the same patience Maren associated with people who had made peace with time. The Okafors at Cabin 17, a young couple renovating a place that had been condemned twice before they bought it for a song. And she learned, slowly, the way you learn a bruise is there by pressing on it, the shape of Lake Wren Shore's HOA. Roger Callahan had been board president for 11 years. He had the particular energy of a man who had once run for a bigger office, lost, and settled for the biggest fish tank available in his particular pond. He wore golf shirts with the HOA logo embroidered on the breast, an actual embroidered logo, on a homeowners association shirt, which told Maren everything she needed to know about the man's relationship to scale. He'd been re-elected unopposed for the last 4 cycles, in part because Lake Wren Shore's bylaws required a physical presence at the annual meeting to nominate a challenger, and the annual meeting was always scheduled for the second Tuesday of January, at 10 in the morning, when half the lakefront owners were snowbirds in Florida and the other half were at work. Roger had 2 sons. The older one had gone into insurance and mostly stayed out of the community's business. The younger one was Tyler, 26, freshly finished with a business degree from a school Maren had never heard of, currently unemployed in any traditional sense but extremely aggressively employed in the sense that mattered to his father. Tyler had, 6 months earlier, formed something called Wren Point Rentals LLC, registered in Delaware for reasons that would later become extremely relevant to the district attorney's office, with the stated business purpose of premium short-term lakefront hospitality experiences. What that meant, in practice, was this. Tyler wanted to run an Airbnb empire out of Lake Wren Shore's best cabins, the 8 or 9 lakefront units with private docks and unobstructed water views, and he wanted to do it without the inconvenience of actually owning any of them. Now that you know Maren, has your HOA ever pulled something that made your blood boil? Tell me the worst thing your HOA has ever done, because I promise you, what's coming next is worse. The way it worked, and it took Maren 4 months, 2 records requests, 1 furious call to a friend in the State Attorney General's Consumer Protection Unit, and 1 very illegal-feeling night reading 11 years of board minutes at her kitchen table to fully understand it, was this. Section 7.4 of the Lake Wren Shore's CC&Rs, recorded in 1994 when the community was first platted, contained a clause called the Community Recreational Access Provision. It had been written, according to the original developer's notes, that Maren eventually found buried in a county archive, to allow the HOA to schedule occasional supervised access to the community boat launch and shared dock during the 2 annual lake festivals, back when only 6 lakefront cabins existed, and everyone knew everyone. In 2019, under Roger Callahan's presidency, the board had voted, at a meeting with 4 of 9 board members present, which met the letter of quorum but not, in Maren's professional opinion, as someone who'd spent a career reading bad faith paperwork, the spirit of it, to clarify Section 7.4. The clarification redefined community recreational access to include any lakefront cabin the board determined, in its sole discretion, was underutilized by its owner. Underutilized was defined, helpfully, as occupied by the titled owner fewer than 120 days per calendar year, as determined by board observation or utility records. In other words, if you owned one of the good cabins and didn't live there full-time, the board could decide your home was community recreational access property and open it up for HOA-sanctioned use. And Tyler Callahan's LLC had, for the last 5 months, been the sole vendor contracted by the HOA to manage that community recreational access, for a management fee of 35% of gross rental revenue, paid directly to Ren Point Rentals LLC, out of a special account that existed entirely outside the HOA's audited operating budget. Maren had underestimated a lot of criminals in her career. She had never underestimated one who put his scheme in writing, notarized it, and filed it with the County Register of Deeds. Roger Callahan had done exactly that, 4 years running, because he had never once imagined anyone in Lake Wren Shores would actually read the documents. Nobody had, until a homicide detective bought Cabin 14 because she liked the water view. Her first fine notice came 11 days after the dock confrontation. It arrived by certified mail, HOA letterhead, signed by the Compliance Committee, referencing Section 7.4 as amended, and citing Cabin 14 for non-compliant occupancy documentation, failure to file annual recreational use disclosure form. The fine was $250. The letter noted that failure to remit within 30 days would result in escalating penalties per the HOA's fee schedule, and that continued non-compliance could result in the board exercising its recreational access rights under Section 7.4, regardless of the owner's payment status. Maren read it twice, standing at her own mailbox in her uniform on her way to a shift, and felt something she hadn't felt in years, the specific, cold water clarity of realizing she was looking at a crime, not a crime like the ones she usually worked. No body, no blood spatter, no 911 call at 2 a.m. This was slower, quieter. The kind of crime that happened in conference rooms with bad fluorescent lighting, in folding chairs, over the course of a decade, one procedurally correct-looking letter at a time, until an 83-year-old widower or a young couple, stretched thin on their mortgage, looked up one day and realized the home they'd paid for wasn't fully theirs anymore. She paid the $250. Then she opened a folder on her personal laptop, labeled it Cabin 14, Documentation, and started doing what 16 years of training had taught her to do, with anything that smelled wrong. She started building a file. The second letter came 3 weeks later. This one was for $475, citing escalated non-compliance, and it included, for the first time, an explicit reference to Ren Point Rentals LLC as the authorized recreational access administrator for Heron Point Road cabins, with a note that a recreational use assessment walkthrough had been scheduled for the following Friday between 9 and 11 in the morning, and that Maren's presence was not required for the walkthrough to proceed. That was the letter that told her this wasn't really about a form. This was about a key. She called the HOA management company's front office, a 2-person operation run out of a strip mall that handled paperwork for 6 different associations and clearly didn't ask questions about any of them, and asked, in a voice she'd once used to interview a man who'd murdered his business partner over a storage unit, exactly what statutory authority the association believed it had to enter a privately titled residence without the owner's consent. The woman on the phone put her on hold for 4 minutes and came back reading, verbatim, from what was obviously a script Roger Callahan had written himself. Per our governing documents, the association retains recreational access rights to underutilized lakefront properties, and Mr. Callahan has advised that non-cooperation may result in a special assessment lien being filed against the property to recover unpaid recreational compliance fees. A lien on her home over a form she'd never been told existed until she'd already owned the cabin, filed by a board president whose son stood to personally profit off the very rental business that non-compliance was supposedly funding. $315 became $475, became by the end of the second month a cumulative $1,100 in cited fines, plus a formal notice of intent to file special assessment lien in the amount of $2,200, which under North Carolina's Planned Community Act was enough, if left unpaid past 90 days, to begin the process of an association-initiated foreclosure action against a titled property. $2,200 against a woman who had spent 4 years of overtime pay closing on this cabin, so she'd finally have somewhere the job couldn't follow her home to. Foreclosure over the price of a used car, because her cabin had the best dock on the lake, and a 26-year-old with a Delaware LLC wanted it for the summer season. $1,100 in fabricated fines and a $2,200 foreclosure lien over a form that didn't exist until Maren Castillo bought the best dock on the lake, against a detective sergeant who documents everything for a living. Is this legal where you live? What would you have done in her position? She kept working her shifts. That was the strange discipline of it, the thing nobody who hasn't worked a badge understands about how you carry 2 lives at once. By day, she was interviewing a bookkeeper who'd been quietly draining a construction firm's payroll account for 11 months, walking him through his own spreadsheets until he broke down and admitted what she already knew from the numbers alone. And by night, she was sitting at her own kitchen table with a legal pad, doing the exact same work to her own home. She requested, formally, in writing, a full accounting of the Wren Point Rentals LLC management contract under North Carolina's Planned Community Act, which she'd checked twice, because this was the kind of thing you check twice before you staked your career on it, entitled any homeowner in a mandatory HOA to inspect the association's financial records, contracts, and board meeting minutes upon written request, with the association required to produce them within a reasonable time or provide a legally sufficient reason for withholding them. The HOA's response, 6 weeks later, 4 days past the statutory deadline she'd cited in her second letter, was a box. Not digital records. A physical, water-damaged banker's box, dropped off at her door by the same strip mall management company, containing what she quickly realized was an intentionally disorganized, incomplete, and in several places deliberately shredded collection of meeting minutes going back 4 years. Somebody, at some point recently, had gone through those records with scissors. That was the moment, sitting on her living room floor at 11 at night, cross-referencing torn minutes against dated fine notices against her own bank statements, that Maren Castillo stopped thinking of this as a homeowner dispute and started thinking of it as an open case. She'd spent enough of her career watching guilty men panic into making things worse. Shredding records wasn't the act of a board covering up a paperwork error. It was the act of a board covering up something they knew, on some level, was already a crime. Mr. Denby at Cabin 11 stopped fishing off his dock for 8 straight days in the middle of the 3rd month, and when Maren finally walked over to check on him, she found him at his kitchen table with a fine notice of his own. $600, recreational compliance, underutilization, because he'd spent 3 weeks that spring visiting his daughter in Charleston after his hip surgery, and the board had apparently been watching his utility usage the whole time. 83 years old, he told her, voice flat with the particular exhaustion of a man who had already decided He didn't have the fight left in him. 31 years I've lived on this lake, and they want to tell me my own house isn't mine enough of the time. The Okafors at Cabin 17 got a recreational access walkthrough scheduled while they were at work, and came home to find their back door unlocked, muddy footprints on their new floors, and a note on their counter, not from the HOA, but from a rental guest, thanking the owners for a lovely weekend and leaving $40 on the counter for the trouble of a dead battery in the smoke detector. That was the moment it stopped being about Maren's dock at all. It became, in the language she used in the file she was building, the same clean, dispassionate, fact-first language she used for every case that had ever ended with somebody in handcuffs. A pattern of conduct. Selective enforcement against absent, elderly, or otherwise vulnerable lakefront owners, timed to coincide with unauthorized access by a board-affiliated rental operation, funded by fees the board itself imposed, laundered through a management contract the board itself approved, at a 35% margin that flowed directly into an LLC owned by the board president's son. Maren had built cases on less. She had put men away for less careful crimes than this one. The lien notice on Cabin 14 arrived formally on a Tuesday in the 4th month, $2,200, 90 days to cure, or the association would initiate the statutory foreclosure process through its attorney. She read it standing at her own kitchen counter, in the same robe she'd been wearing the morning Tyler Callahan stood on her dock and told her to hand over the key, and this time when she felt the cold, focused anger settle into her chest, she didn't push it down the way she'd learned to, for every victim's family she'd ever had to deliver bad news to. This time it was hers to keep. She picked up her phone and texted her old partner from financial crimes, a detective named Odell Priest, who'd since moved over to the DA's Economic Crimes Unit. 4 words: need a coffee, bring patience. Detective Sergeant Castillo just made a critical move. She stopped treating Lake Wren Shores like a neighborhood dispute and started treating it like an open case. Was that the right call? What's your strategy if it were you sitting across from that lien notice? Odell Priest had been Maren's training officer's protege 15 years earlier, back when she was still a beat cop wondering if financial crimes was too boring for her taste, and he had spent the intervening decade proving to her, case after case, that boring was just another word for patient. He listened to the whole thing over 2 cups of gas station coffee at a picnic table outside a substation, not saying anything until she got to the part about the shredded minutes. "You know what this is," he said. It wasn't a question. "I know what I think it is. Say it anyway. Embezzlement. Breach of fiduciary duty. At minimum, civilly. But I think there's a fraud case underneath it too, because the LLC structure isn't a coincidence. It's a shell. And I think the recreational access thing isn't a real HOA policy. It's a scheme dressed up in policy language, so a judge who's never dealt with an HOA before might look at it and think it's just a boring civil covenant dispute instead of what it actually is. Which is? A 26-year-old kid and his father, systematically identifying the most valuable properties in a community they control, manufacturing compliance violations against owners least likely to fight back, and using the threat of foreclosure to functionally seize use of those properties for a private rental business that only they profit from. She said it the way she'd say a closing argument because some part of her had already started writing one. Odell was quiet for a second. Then he said the thing she needed to hear, which was also the thing that scared her most, because it meant this was real. That's not an HOA dispute, Maren. That's extortion under color of authority, plus embezzlement of association funds, plus wire fraud if any of those payments crossed state lines through that Delaware LLC, which I'd bet my pension they did. You need to file this properly, not as a homeowner, as a witness with a badge who happens to also be the victim. That distinction mattered more than Maren had initially understood. A homeowner complaint against an HOA typically got routed to a civil magistrate, filed in a queue behind 100 other petty covenant disputes about fence heights and paint colors, and took months to even get a hearing date. But a sworn law enforcement officer, filing a formal complaint alleging embezzlement of association funds and fraud in the inducement of fee assessments, with documentary evidence including torn financial records and a documented pattern of selective enforcement against vulnerable homeowners. That got routed somewhere else entirely. That got routed to the State Bureau of Investigation's Financial Crimes Unit and, because HOAs in North Carolina fall under a specific statutory framework, the State Attorney General's office takes seriously when there's a whiff of fraud, straight into the Consumer Protection Division's open case list. Maren spent the next 3 weeks doing the work she was best at, the work that had taken her from a patrol car to a detective's desk in half the time it took most people. She built the timeline. She subpoenaed, through Odell, working the request through proper channels rather than her own badge, because she understood better than anyone the difference between a righteous case and a compromised one, the bank records for the HOA's operating account, and the separate account tied to Wren Point Rentals, LLC. She cross-referenced every fine notice issued in the last 4 years against the property tax records for each cited home and found exactly what she expected. Every single fine tied to a lakefront cabin owned by someone over 70, someone who traveled frequently for work, or someone recently widowed. Not one fine had ever been issued against a board member's property, despite 3 of the 9 board members owning lakefront cabins themselves that sat empty more often than Maren's ever had. She found 4 years of board meeting minutes that referenced the Recreational Access Program only in the vaguest possible terms, always at the tail end of meetings when attendance had thinned, always voted on by the same 4-member quorum, and never once disclosed at the annual meeting where the wider membership might actually be paying attention. She found the Delaware filing for Wren Point Rentals, LLC, registered 5 months before the clarification of Section 7.4 that made its business model possible, which told her the fraud hadn't followed the policy. The policy had been engineered specifically to enable the fraud. And she found, buried in an invoice she almost missed because it was filed under landscaping services rather than any of the rental line items, a $41,000 payment from the HOA's reserve fund, the fund legally required to be preserved for structural maintenance, road repair, and the community dock system, directly into the Wren Point Rentals LLC account, disguised as a dock infrastructure partnership fee. $41,000 of reserve fund money, meant for 211 homeowners' shared infrastructure, quietly funneled into a rental business run by the board president's unemployed son. $1,100 in fines against Maren Castillo. $41,000 in reserve funds diverted to Tyler Callahan's private business. Selective enforcement against every widow, veteran, and retiree on Heron Point Road. Is this happening in your community right now and you just haven't found the paperwork yet? What would you do if you found the box of shredded records at your own front door? The coalition started, the way most real ones do, with a single phone call between 2 people who trusted each other more than they trusted the system. Maren called Mrs. Alvarez at Cabin 9 first because Mrs. Alvarez had brought her 3 pies in 8 months without ever once asking for anything back, and because Maren had noticed, in her financial timeline, that the Alvarez family had been fined twice in the last 2 years for recreational underutilization during the exact weeks they'd closed the diner for their annual trip to visit family in Puerto Rico. She told Mrs. Alvarez enough, not everything, because a sworn investigation required a certain discipline about what got shared and when, but enough to watch the woman's face shift from confusion to recognition to the same cold, focused anger Maren had been carrying for weeks. "I knew it," Mrs. Alvarez said. "I knew something was wrong when they fined us for being closed, the same week our own cousin told us he'd rented our dock slip for a bachelor party." From there, it moved fast, the way a fire moves once it finds enough dry wood. Mr. Denby, once he understood his $600 fine wasn't a bureaucratic mistake, but a deliberate pattern, agreed to let Maren use his case as a documented example, on the record, in whatever filing came next. The Okafors, furious about the muddy footprints and the stranger's note on their counter, produced their own security camera footage that clearly showed, at 11:47 on a Tuesday morning, a cleaning crew from Wren Point Rentals letting themselves in with a key the HOA's compliance committee had apparently authorized without the Okafors' knowledge or consent. By the end of the third week, Maren had statements, timelines, and documentary evidence from 11 different lakefront households, every one of them fined under Section 7.4, every one of them absent, elderly, disabled, or otherwise less likely to show up and fight at a 10 a.m. Tuesday meeting in January. She scheduled a meeting of her own, not with the HOA, with Odell and with a lieutenant in the SBI's Financial Crimes Division named Priya Shah, who read Maren's 28-page timeline over a single sitting, looked up, and said the sentence Maren had been waiting 4 months to hear from someone with the authority to act on it. This is enough for a warrant. The formal complaint went in on a Thursday. It named Roger Callahan, HOA Board President, and Tyler Callahan, Principal of Wren Point Rentals, LLC, alleging breach of fiduciary duty, embezzlement of association reserve funds, and fraud in the administration of the Section 7.4 Recreational Access Provision. It cited North Carolina's Planned Community Act, the state's UTPA Unfair Trade Practices Statute, and, because Odell had insisted on including it, and Maren had agreed the moment she read the language, a specific reference to the pattern of selective enforcement, disproportionately targeting elderly and disabled homeowners, language that echoed federal fair housing concerns, even though this wasn't technically a Fair Housing Act case. The State Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division opened a formal investigation within 9 days, and that was when Tyler Callahan, entirely unaware that any of this was happening, decided the smartest move available to him was to escalate. He came back to Cabin 14 on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after the investigation opened, with 2 friends in a truck, and a folder of paperwork he was extremely proud of, and this time, instead of a clipboard, he had what he believed was his trump card. A notarized letter from the HOA's attorney formally notifying Maren that, due to continued non-payment of the special assessment lien, the association was exercising its Section 7.4 recreational access rights, effective immediately, and that Wren Point Rentals had a guest checking in at 4 o'clock that afternoon. "We tried to do this the easy way," Tyler told her, standing on her porch this time instead of her dock, his 2 friends hanging back by the truck, like men who'd been told this would be a quick errand, and were beginning to suspect otherwise. "But you didn't pay, and you didn't cooperate, so now it's just how it is. Hand over the key, or we're changing the locks ourselves. My dad's attorney says we're within our rights." Maren looked at the letter he was holding out, looked at the 2 friends by the truck, looked at Tyler Callahan's sunburned, entirely unbothered face, and felt something settle in her chest that was almost, but not quite, relief. Because she had been carrying this alone, in the careful, procedural, badge-first way she'd been trained to carry every open case, for 4 months. And now, standing on her own porch, being threatened with an illegal lockout by a man who had built his entire personality around never once being told no, she finally got to say the sentence she had been waiting to say since the morning he first stood on her dock. "You should probably know," she said, "that I'm a detective sergeant with the county sheriff's office, that you are currently, on recorded audio, threatening to unlawfully enter and change the locks on a private residence that is the subject of an active state attorney general fraud investigation into your family's business, and that everything you just said is going to be in my supplemental report by tonight." Tyler Callahan's face did something Maren had seen 100 times before, on 100 different faces across 100 different interrogation tables. The specific, involuntary collapse of a man realizing, in real time, that the story he'd been telling himself about his own power had just run headfirst into the truth. You're a cop? Detective Sergeant, Maren said again, evenly. And you and your friends are going to get back in that truck, and you're going to leave my property, and if I so much as hear your name near this dock again, the next conversation we have is going to happen at the county detention center. Behind her, her phone was already recording. It had been recording since the truck pulled up. Tyler Callahan just walked onto a cop's porch and threatened to break into her house, completely unaware he was on recorded audio and staring down the barrel of his own arrest. Was that the dumbest move you've ever seen someone make in real time? Tell me if your HOA has ever crossed a line this reckless. The arrest, when it came, happened fast and quiet, which was how Maren preferred her actual criminal cases to end, even when the personal ones took 4 months of paperwork to get there. 2 deputies she'd worked alongside for years showed up at the Callahan residence on a Tuesday morning with a warrant built partly on the state's financial fraud investigation and partly on Maren's own sworn statement regarding the attempted unlawful entry. And Tyler Callahan was charged with attempted breaking and entering, communicating threats, and, because the state's case had moved with unusual speed, once a sworn law enforcement officer's own home became a documented victim property, conspiracy to commit embezzlement, as a co-conspirator in his father's diversion of HOA reserve funds. Roger Callahan was charged separately, and more extensively, embezzlement of association funds under North Carolina's Planned Community Act, breach of fiduciary duty, and multiple counts of fraud tied to the diverted reserve fund payments the state's forensic accountants confirmed totaled just over $93,000 over 4 years once they finished tracing every disguised invoice Maren's original timeline had flagged. The board meeting that followed, 3 weeks later, was not the kind of meeting Lake Wren Shores had ever seen before. It was held in the community clubhouse, standing room only, 211 households represented by roughly 140 actual bodies packed into folding chairs and lining the walls, because word had gotten out, the way it always does in a place small enough that everyone eventually hears everything, that the board president was facing criminal charges and that a detective who lived on Heron Point Road had been the one to unravel it. Maren didn't speak first. She'd told Odell and Priya Shah both, in the lead-up to the meeting, that she wanted the coalition to speak first, Mrs. Alvarez and the Okafors, and, in a moment that brought the entire room to a hush, so complete Maren could hear the ceiling fans. Mr. Denby, 83 years old, standing slowly with a cane in one hand and his $600 fine notice in the other, telling a room full of his neighbors that he'd fished off that dock for 31 years and had started to believe, these last few months, that the home he'd raised his children in wasn't really his anymore. By the time Maren stood up to present the financial timeline, the $41,000, then the full $93,000 once the state's accountants finished, the Delaware LLC filing dated 5 months before the policy that made it profitable, the shredded minutes, the pattern of fines against exactly the homeowners least equipped to fight back. The room didn't need convincing. It needed permission to be as angry as it already was. The recall vote wasn't even close. Under the HOA's bylaws, a special meeting could be called with a petition signed by 15% of homeowners, which the coalition had gathered in 4 days, and the vote to remove the 4 board members who'd formed the quorum behind the Section 7.4 clarification passed with 91% in favor, the kind of number that doesn't happen in local politics unless everyone involved has finally stopped pretending they don't know what they saw. A new interim board was seated that same night, with Mrs. Alvarez, of all people, nominated from the floor and elected as the new president by a show of hands so immediate it barely counted as a vote. After everything Maren Castillo went through, the fines, the lien, the threats on her own porch, was it worth it? Have you ever fought your HOA and won? Or walked away because the fight cost more than the house was worth? Tell me your story, because I want to hear every single one of them. Roger Callahan pled guilty 11 weeks later to embezzlement and breach of fiduciary duty, in a deal that spared the community a lengthy trial but did not spare him restitution. Full repayment of the $93,000, plus a 5-year suspension from serving on any homeowners association board anywhere in the state of North Carolina, a provision Maren had specifically pushed the DA's office to include, because she had learned, over 16 years, that men like Roger Callahan rarely stopped finding new small kingdoms to run unless someone made it structurally impossible. Tyler pled guilty to the conspiracy charge and to communicating threats, and received 18 months of probation, community service, and a restitution obligation tied jointly to his father's, along with a permanent dissolution order for Wren Point Rentals, LLC. The last Maren heard, he'd taken a job selling boats at a marina 2 counties over, which struck her as either an appropriate irony or a genuine tragedy, depending on how charitable she was feeling on a given day. The new board, under Mrs. Alvarez, spent its first 6 months doing the unglamorous, essential work that Roger Callahan's regime had never bothered with. A full independent audit of the reserve fund, a rewritten Section 7.4 that stripped out the recreational access language entirely and replaced it with a straightforward, transparent guest dock reservation system open to every homeowner on equal terms, and a new bylaw, proposed by Mr. Denby himself and passed unanimously, requiring the annual meeting to be scheduled at a time and on a day when the community's actual, working, traveling, aging membership could reasonably attend. Maren kept her cabin. She kept her dock, every board of which she had personally repaired with her own hands, and she kept fishing off the end of it some mornings before her shift, coffee going cold in a mug that said nothing about badges or boards or Delaware LLCs, just a lake, and the particular kind of quiet she'd bought this place to find in the first place. She still thought, sometimes, about the exact tone Tyler Callahan had used that first morning. Hand over the key, like it had never once occurred to him that the woman standing in that doorway might already know exactly what a key was worth, might already know how to read a paper trail better than he knew how to hide one, might have spent 16 years of her life learning precisely how these stories ended, for men who assumed the world owed them whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted it. She'd told him, that day on her porch. He hadn't believed her, not really, not until the deputies showed up at his father's door with a warrant. That, more than anything else, was the part she kept coming back to. Not the $93,000, not the recall vote, not even Mr. Denby standing up in that packed clubhouse with 31 years of fishing behind him and a cane in his hand. It was the look on Tyler Callahan's face in that half-second after she said the word detective, the exact moment a man who had never once been told no in his entire comfortable life finally understood, all at once, precisely who he had been talking to. If you've ever stood in a doorway like that one, staring down someone who assumed your home was theirs to take, drop your story below, because somewhere out there, right now, there's another Roger Callahan writing another Section 7.4, betting that nobody in his community is paying close enough attention to catch him. This time, somebody was. The second fine notice hadn't been the last one before the lien, and Maren's file didn't stop growing just because she'd started calling Odell. 3 days after the $475 letter, a new one arrived. This one addressed not to Cabin 14, but to Cabin 6, 2 doors down from the Alvarezes, where a widower named Frank Tuominen had lived alone since his wife passed the year before Maren moved in. Frank's fine was for unauthorized structural non-compliance. A ramp he'd built onto his back porch after a stroke left his left side weaker than it used to be. A ramp the compliance committee had somehow decided, without ever inspecting it, violated Section 9.2's prohibition on non-original architectural modifications to lakefront elevations. Maren found out about it the way she found out about most things at Lake Wren Shores now. which was that people had started walking their fine notices down to her dock, instead of throwing them away in frustration. Frank showed up on a Thursday evening, holding the letter like it might bite him, apologizing for bothering her, and Maren sat him down at her kitchen table and read it twice before she said anything at all. "They're fining you for a wheelchair ramp," she said. "I told them what it was for," Frank said. "The lady in the office said the board doesn't make exceptions for individual circumstances, that it sets a precedent." Maren didn't say what she was thinking, which was that Frank's ramp fine had arrived 4 days after the Okafor's unauthorized walkthrough, and 6 days after her own lien notice, all 3 timed within the same 10-day stretch that, she would later confirm from the shredded minutes, corresponded exactly to a board meeting where Roger Callahan had specifically discussed increasing compliance revenue ahead of the summer rental season. She just took a photo of Frank's letter, added it to the folder, and told him the same thing she'd started telling everyone who came to her door with a fine in hand: don't pay it yet, and don't sign anything, and keep every piece of paper they send you. The Fair Housing Act angle hadn't originally been part of Maren's case. It became part of it the night she cross-referenced Frank's ramp citation against the association's own architectural review log, and found that a board member's guest house, 2 lots over, had a nearly identical ramp installed 18 months earlier for an elderly parent, never once cited, never once mentioned in a single compliance letter. Selective enforcement wasn't just a pattern against absent owners anymore. It was a pattern against exactly the kind of accommodation federal law was built to protect, enforced against everyone except the people who governed the enforcement. She called Priya Shah about it before she called Odell, because she wanted a second read from someone who worked fraud for a living before she let herself believe what the numbers were telling her. Priya read the comparison over the phone, went quiet for a second, and said, "That's not just a civil violation anymore, Maren. That's disability discrimination layered on top of everything else. You need to fold that into the complaint, not file it separately, because a prosecutor is going to want the jury to understand this wasn't sloppy governance. This was targeted." The public humiliation came in the 4th month, right around the time the lien notice landed, and it came exactly the way these things always come in small communities, not through official channels but through a bulletin board. The HOA's clubhouse had a corkboard by the mailroom, where the compliance committee, per its own bylaws, was required to post a monthly community standards summary. For 3 years, that summary had listed violations by unit number only, a small mercy that let people pretend their neighbors didn't know whose name went with cabin 6 or cabin 14. In the 4th month, someone on the compliance committee, Maren never proved who, though she had a strong suspicion it traced back to Tyler, who by then knew exactly who she was, and had apparently decided humiliation was a better weapon than paperwork, started listing full names. Maren Castillo, cabin 14, outstanding recreational compliance assessment, $2,200, subject to lien filing. Frank Tuomanen, cabin 6, unauthorized structural modification, subject to removal order. It sat there on the corkboard for 11 days, before Mrs. Alvarez tore it down herself, in front of 3 other homeowners, and said, loudly enough that it made it into the file Maren was building as an unsolicited witness statement, that she'd never in her life seen an HOA publicly shame an 80-something stroke survivor for building a ramp to his own back door. That was the week the shunning started, small and petty in the way these things always are. A woman Maren had exchanged pleasant nods with at the mailbox for months started crossing the road instead of walking past cabin 14. Someone left an anonymous note in Maren's mailbox suggesting that some people think they're above the rules just because of their job, which told Maren that word of her badge had already started leaking, unofficially, before she'd ever confirmed it publicly herself. It cost her something, that stretch, more than the money ever did. The specific loneliness of being punished by a community for refusing to be quietly robbed by it. She didn't talk about that part much, even to Odell. But she wrote it down anyway, in the file, because a prosecutor building an intimidation and retaliation narrative needed to know that the campaign against her hadn't stayed contained to paperwork. The coalition grew past the original 11 households by the start of the 5th week, once people understood that the state was actually looking at this, and that speaking up wasn't going to end with their own name posted on a corkboard. A retired contractor at Cabin 22 came forward with 4 years of invoices he'd quietly kept after the board hired an outside landscaping crew at triple his own quoted rate for the exact same seasonal work. A contract Maren's timeline later confirmed had gone to a company registered at the same Delaware address as Wren Point Rentals LLC. A young couple at Cabin 3, newer to the lake than even Maren, produced text messages from a board member's wife casually mentioning, months before any official notice went out, that Tyler's got some units lined up for the summer. Don't be surprised if you get a letter. By the time Maren sat down with Odell and Priya Shah for the meeting that led to the formal complaint, she wasn't presenting 11 data points anymore. She was presenting 19, spanning 4 years, 3 separate contractors, 1 fair housing adjacent discrimination pattern, and a Delaware paper trail thick enough that Priya Shah told her flatly, "I've seen federal fraud cases with less documentation than what you've built in your spare time between shifts." The warrant that put deputies at Roger Callahan's door didn't come alone. It came alongside a parallel search warrant for the HOA's management office, executed the same morning, where investigators recovered 3 additional years of financial records the board had never disclosed in response to Maren's original request. Records that confirmed the reserve fund diversion had actually started a full year earlier than the $41,000 invoice Maren had first flagged. Pushing the final restitution figure, the state's forensic accountants calculated, from $93,000 to just over $118,000, once every disguised landscaping, infrastructure partnership, and consulting line item was traced back to its true destination. The courtroom, when it finally happened, wasn't the theatrical showdown people sometimes imagine when they picture a case like this ending. It was a Tuesday morning in a county courthouse 40 minutes from the lake, a plea hearing rather than a trial, because Roger Callahan's attorney had read the state's evidence file and recommended, in no uncertain terms, that his client take the deal being offered, rather than let a jury see 19 households' worth of documented selective enforcement against widows, veterans, and a stroke survivor's wheelchair ramp. Maren sat in the second row, off-duty, in plain clothes, next to Mrs. Alvarez and Frank Tuominen, who'd insisted on being there, despite needing his daughter to drive him. The judge read the restitution figure into the record, $118,400, joint and several between Roger and Tyler Callahan, and Maren watched Roger's face do the same thing Tyler's had done on her porch months earlier. The specific collapse of a man realizing the story he'd told himself about his own untouchability had finally run out of road. The 5-year board suspension Maren had pushed for got written into the plea agreement almost word for word as she'd requested it. Barred from serving on or being employed by any homeowners association, board, committee, or management company in the state of North Carolina for 5 years following the completion of his sentence. Tyler's 18 months of probation came with a condition his own attorney hadn't fought very hard against: 200 hours of community service to be completed, at the judge's specific and clearly unamused direction, doing accessibility-related volunteer work for a nonprofit that built wheelchair ramps for elderly homeowners who couldn't afford them. Maren didn't say anything when she heard that condition read aloud. She just felt Frank Tuominen's hand find hers on the bench beside her, and squeeze once, and that was enough. The clubhouse meeting 3 weeks later ran 2.5 hours, not because anyone was dragging it out, but because once the room understood what had actually happened over 4 years, everyone had something they needed to say out loud, in front of their neighbors, for the record. Mrs. Alvarez read the full financial timeline into the meeting minutes herself, board president gavel in hand, before turning the floor over to a vote that removed the last of Roger Callahan's holdover allies from the Compliance Committee, 94% in favor, this time higher even than the original recall. The new bylaws passed that night went further than Maren had expected. Beyond the rewritten Section 7.4 and the rescheduled annual meeting, the new board adopted a mandatory annual third-party financial audit, publicly posted rather than buried in a banker's box, and a new provision, proposed by the Okafors, seconded by the retired contractor from Cabin 22, requiring any board-affiliated business relationship, no matter how small, to be disclosed to the full membership before a vote, not slipped through a four-person quorum on a Tuesday afternoon when nobody who mattered was in the room. Frank Tuominen's ramp got a formal, retroactive exemption written directly into the architectural guidelines, language borrowed almost verbatim from the Fair Housing Act's reasonable accommodation standard, at Maren's specific suggestion, so that no future board could ever again pretend a modification like his required no exceptions for individual circumstances. 6 months after the plea hearing, Maren sat on her dock on a Saturday morning that felt, for the first time in nearly a year, like it belonged entirely to her. Frank fished 2 docks down, same hour, same patience as always, waving when he saw her out. The Okafor's dog barked at a heron near cabin 17. Mrs. Alvarez brought pie, again unprompted, again, and sat with Maren for 20 minutes, talking about nothing in particular, which was its own kind of victory neither of them bothered naming out loud. Maren still thought, some mornings, about the exact tone Tyler Callahan used that first day on her dock. Hand over the key. She thought about how certain he'd sounded, how completely it had never occurred to him that the woman in the doorway might already know, better than he ever would, exactly what it costs a person to build a life worth defending, and exactly how far she was willing to go to make sure nobody took it from her, or from anyone else on that lake, ever again. If your HOA has ever tried to convince you that your own home wasn't fully yours, drop it below. Somewhere out there, another board is writing another Section 7.4 right now, betting nobody's paying close enough attention to catch them. This time, and every time after, somebody was.